Chapter 5 of Moving the Mountain by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. While below, they took me into the patio, that quiet inner garden which was so attractive from above. It was a lovely place. The moon was riding high and shone down into it. A slender fountain spray rose shimmering from its carved basin. On the southern-facing wall a great wisteria vine drooped in budding purple, and beds of violets made the air rich with soft fragrance. Here and there were people walking, and in the shadowy corners sat young couples, apparently quite happy. "I suppose you don't know the names of one of them," I suggested. "On the contrary, I know nearly all," answered Hallie. "These apartments are taken very largely by friends and acquaintances. You see, the gardens and roofs are in common, and there are the reading rooms, ballrooms, and so on. It is pleasanter to be friends to begin with, and most of us get to be afterward, if we are not at first." "But surely there are some disagreeable people left on earth." "Yes, but where there is so much more social life, people get together in congenial sets," put in Nellie. "Just as we used to in summer resorts." "There aren't so many bores and fools as there used to be, John," Owen remarked. "We really do raise better people. Even the old ones have improved. You see, life is so much pleasanter and more interesting."
"We're all healthier, Uncle John, because we're better fed. That makes us more agreeable."
"There's more art in the world to make us happier," said Gerald. "Hallie thinks it's all due to her everlasting bread and butter. Listen to that now." From a balcony up there in the moonlight came a delicious burst of melody, a guitar and two voices, and the refrain was taken up from another window, from one corner of the garden, from the roof, all in smooth accord. "Your group here must be an operatic one," I suggested. But my nephew answered that it was not, but that music, good music, was so common now and so well taught that the average was high in both taste and execution. We sat late that night, my new family bubbling over with things to say, and filling my mind with a confused sense of new advantages, unexplained, and only half believed. I could not bring myself to accept as commonplace facts the unusual excellences so glibly described, and I suppose my silence showed this as well as what I said, for my sister presently intervened with decision. "We must all stop this for tonight," she said. "John feels as if he was being forcibly fed. He's got to rest. Then I suggest that tomorrow Owen take him in hand, go off for a tramp, why don't you? And really straighten out things. You see, there are two distinct movements to consider, the unconscious progress that would have taken place anyway in 30 years, and then the deliberate measures adopted by the new lifers, and it's rather confusing. I've labored with him all the way home now. I think the man's point of view will help." Owen was a big man with a strong, wholesome face, and a quizzical little smile of his own. He and I went up the river next morning in a swift motor boat, which did not batter the still air with muffled banging as they used to do, and strolled off in the bright spring sunshine into Palisade Park. "We've saved all the loveliest of it, for keeps," he said. "Out here, where the grass and trees are just as they used to be, you won't be bothered, and one expositor will be easier to handle than four at once. Now, shall I talk, or will you ask questions?" "I'd like to ask a few questions first, then you can expound by the hour. Do give me the long and short of this 'women waked up' proposition. What does it mean to a man?" Owen stroked his chin. "No loss," he said at length. "At least, no loss that's not covered by a greater gain. Do you remember the new biological theory in regard to the relative position of the sexes that was beginning to make headway when we were young?" I nodded. "Ward's theory? Oh yes, I heard something of it. Pretty far-fetched, it seemed to me." "Far-fetched and dear bought, but true for all that. You'll have to swallow it. The female is the race type, the male is her assistant. It's established beyond peradventure." I meditated painfully. I looked at Owen. He had just as happy and proud a look as if he was a real man, not merely an assistant. I thought of Gerald, nothing cowed about him, of the officers and men on the ship, of such men as I had seen in the street. "I suppose this applies in the main to remote origins?" I suggested. "It holds good all through life. It's just as true as it ever was." "Then do you mean that women run everything, and men are only helpers?" "Oh, no, I wasn't talking about human life at all. Only about sex. Running things has nothing to do with that. Women run some businesses and are in practically all, but men still do the bulk of the world's work. There is a natural division of labor, after all." This was pleasant to hear, but he dashed my hopes. "Men do almost all the violent, plain work, digging and hewing and hammering. Women, as a class, prefer the administrative and constructive kinds. But all that is open yet, and settling itself gradually, men and women are working everywhere. The big change which Nellie is always referring to means simply that women waked up to a realization of the fact that they were human beings." "What were they before, pray?" "Only female beings." "Female human beings, of course," said I. "Yes, a little human, but mostly female. Now they are mostly human. It is a great change." "I don't follow you. Aren't they still wives and mothers?" "They are still mothers, far more so than they were before, as a matter of fact. But as to being wives, there's a difference." I was displeased, and showed it. "Well, is it polygamy, or polyandry, or trial marriages, or what?" Owen gazed at me with an expression very like Nellie's. "There it is," he said. "You can only think about women in some sort of relation to men, of a change in marriage relations as merely a change in kind, whereas what has happened is a change in degree. We still have monogamous marriages, on a much purer and more lasting plane than a generation ago, but the word wife does not mean what it used to." "Go on. I can't follow you at all." "A wife used to be a possession. 'Wilt thou be mine?' said the lover, and the wife was his." "Well, whose else is she now?" I asked with some sharpness. "She does not belong to any one in that old sense. She is the wife of her husband in that she is his true lover, and that their marriage is legally recorded. But her life and work does not belong to him. He has no right to her services any more. A woman who is in a business, like Hallie, for instance, does not give it up when she marries." I stopped him. "What? Isn't Hallie married?" "No, not yet." "But that is her flat?" "Yes, why not?" He laughed at me. "You see, you can't imagine a woman having a home of her own. Hallie is 23. She won't marry for some years probably, but she has her position and is doing excellent work. It's only a minor inspectorship, but she likes it. Why shouldn't she have a home?" "Why doesn't she have it with you?" "Because I like to live with my wife. Her business and mine are in Michigan, Hallie's in New York." "And when she marries she keeps on being an inspector?" I queried. "Precisely. The man who marries that young woman will have much happiness, but he will not own her, and she will not be his wife in the sense of a servant. She will not darn his socks or cook his meals. Why should she?" "Will she not nurse his babies?" "No. She will nurse her babies, their babies, not his merely." "And keep on being an inspector?" "And keep on being an inspector, for 4 hours a day, in 2 shifts. Not a bit more difficult than cooking, my dear boy." "But she will not be with her children." "She will be with her children 20 hours out of the 24, if she wants to. But Hallie's not specially good with children. You see, John, the women have specialized, even in motherhood." Then he went on at considerable length to show how there had arisen a recognition of far more efficient motherhood than was being given, that those women best fitted for the work had given eager, devoted lives to it, and built up a new science of humaniculture, that no woman was allowed to care for her children without proof of capacity. "Allowed by whom?" I put in. "By the other women. The Department of Child Culture. The government. And the fathers? Do they submit to this tamely? No, they cheerfully agree and approve. Absolutely the biggest thing that has happened, some of us think, is that new recognition of the importance of childhood. We are raising better people now." I was silent for a while, pulling up bits of grass and snapping small sticks into inch pieces. "There was a good deal of talk about eugenics, I remember," I said at last. "And what was that thing? Endowment of motherhood?" "Yes, man's talk," Owen explained. "You see, John, we couldn't look at women but in one way in the old days. It was all a question of sex with us, inevitably, we being males. Our whole idea of improvement was in better breeding. Our whole idea of motherhood was in each woman's devoting her whole life to her own children. That turbid freshet of an Englishman, Wells, who did so much to stir his generation, said, 'I am wholly feminist.' And he was. He saw women only as females and wanted them endowed as such. He was never able to see them as human beings and amply competent to take care of themselves. Now our women, getting hold of this idea that they really are human creatures, simply blossomed forth in new efficiency. They specialized the food business. Hallie's right about the importance of that. And then they specialized the baby business. All women who wish to have babies. But if they wish to take care of them, they must show a diploma." I looked at him. I didn't like it. But what difference did that make? I had died 30 years ago, it appeared. "A diploma for motherhood," I repeated. But he corrected me. "Not at all. Any woman can be a mother, if she's normal. I said she had to have a diploma as a child culturist. Quite a different matter." "I don't see the difference." "No, I suppose not. I didn't once," he said. "Any and every mother was supposed to be competent to raise children, and look at the kind of people we raised. You see, we are beginning to learn, just beginning. You needn't imagine that we are in a state of perfection. There are more new projects up for discussion than ever before. We've only made a start. The consequences, so far, are so good that we are boiling over with propositions for future steps." "Go on about the women," I said. "I want to know the worst, and become resigned." "There's nothing very bad to tell," he continued cheerfully. "When a girl is born, she is treated in all ways as if she was a boy. There is no hint made in any distinction between them, except in the perfectly open physiological instruction as to their future duties. Children, young humans, grow up under precisely the same conditions. I speak, of course, of the most advanced people. There are still backward places. There's plenty to do yet. Then the growing girls are taught of their place and power as mothers, and they have tremendously high ideals. That's what has done so much to raise the standard in men. It came hard, but it worked." I raised my head with keen interest, remarking, "I've glimpsed a sort of iron hand in a velvet glove back of all this. What did they do?" Owen looked rather grim for a moment. "The worst of it was 20 or 25 years back. Most of those men are dead. That new religious movement stirred the social ethical sense to sudden power. It coincided with the women's political movement, urging measures for social improvement. Its enormous spread, both by preaching and literature, lit up the whole community with new facts, ideas, and feelings. Health, physical purity, was made a practical ideal. The young women learned the proportion of men with syphilis and gonorrhea, and decided it was wrong to marry them. That was enough. They passed laws in every state requiring a clean bill of health with every marriage license. Diseased men had to die bachelors. That's all." "And did men submit to legislation like that?" I protested. "Why not? It was so patently for the protection of the race, of the family, of the women and children. Women were solid for it, of course, and all the best men with them. To oppose it was almost a confession of guilt, and injured a man's chances of marriage." "It used to be said that any man could find a woman to marry him," I murmured meditatively. "Maybe he could, once. He certainly cannot now. A man who has one of those diseases is so reported, just like smallpox, you see. Moreover, it is registered against him by the Department of Eugenics, Physicians are required to send in lists. Any girl can find out." "It must have left a large proportion of unmarried women." "It did, at first. And that very thing was of great value to the world. They were wise, conscientious, strong women, you see, and they poured all their tremendous force into social service. Lots of them went into child culture, used their mother power that way. It wasn't easy for them. It wasn't easy for the leftover men, either." "It must have increased prostitution to an awful extent," I said. Owen shook his head and regarded me quizzically. "That is the worst of it," he said. "There isn't any." I sat up. I stood up. I walked up and down. "No prostitution? I can't believe it! Why, prostitution is a social necessity, as old as Nineveh." Owen laughed outright. "Too late, old man, too late! I know we used to think so. We did used to call it a social necessity, didn't we? Come now, tell me what necessity it was to the women." I stopped my march and looked at him. "To the women," he repeated. "What did they want of prostitution? What good did it do them?" "Why, they made a living at it," I replied rather lamely. "Yes, a nice, honorable, pleasant, healthy living, didn't they? With all women perfectly well able to earn an excellent living decently, with all women fully educated about these matters and knowing what a horrible death was before them in this business, with all women brought up like human beings and not like oversexed female animals, and with all women quite free to marry if they wished to. How many do you think would choose that kind of business? We never waited for them to choose it, remember. We fooled them and lied to them and dragged them in, and drove them in, forced them in, then kept them as slaves and prisoners. They didn't really enjoy the life, you know that. Why should they go into it if they do not have to accommodate us?" "Do you mean to tell me there are no wantons among women?" I demanded. "No, I don't mean any such thing. There are various kinds of overdeveloped and morbidly developed women as there are men, and we haven't weeded them out entirely. But the whole thing is now recognized as pathological, cases for medical treatment, or perhaps surgical. Besides, wantonness is not prostitution. Prostitution is a social crime of the worst order. No one thing did more harm. The women stamped it out." "Legislated us all into morality, did they?" I inquired sarcastically. "Legislation did a good deal. Education did more. The new religion did most. Social opinion helped. You remember we men never really tried to legislate against prostitution. We wanted it to go on." "Why, surely we did legislate against it, and it was of no use," I protested. "No. We legislated against the women, but not against the men, or the thing itself. We examined the women and fined them and licensed them, and never did anything against the men. Women legislators used very different measures, I assure you." "I suppose it is for the good of the world," I presently admitted. "But—" "But you don't quite like to think of men in this new and peculiar position of having to be good." "Frankly, I don't. I'm willing to be good, but I don't like to be given no choice." "Well, now look at it. As it was, we had one way, according to what we thought was good for us. Rather than lead clean, contented lives at some expense to ourselves in the way of moral and physical control, we deliberately sacrificed an army of women to a horrible life and a more horrible death, and corrupted the blood of the nation. It was on the line of health they made their stand, not on morality alone. Under our new laws it is a crime to poison another human being with syphilis, just as much as to use prussic acid." "Nellie said you had no crime now." "Oh, well, Nellie is an optimist. I suppose she meant the old kinds and definitions. We don't call things 'crimes' any more. And then really there is not a hundredth part of the evil done that there used to be. We know more, you see, and have less temptation." We were silent for a while. I watched a gull float and wheel over the blue water. Big airships flew steadily along certain lines. Little ones sailed about on all sides. One darted over our heads and lit with a soft swoop on an open promontory. "Didn't they used to buzz?" I asked Owen. "Of course. Just as the first motor boats thumped and banged abominably. We will not stand for unnecessary noise as we used to." "How do you stop it? More interference with the individual rights?" "More recognition of public rights. A bad noise is a nuisance, like a bad smell. We didn't used to mind it much, but the women did. You see, what women like has to be considered now." "It always was considered," I broke in with some heat. "The women of America were the most spoiled, pampered lot on earth. Men gave up to them in all ways." "At home, perhaps, but not in public. The city and state weren't run to suit them at all." "Why should they be? Women belong at home. If they push into a man's world they ought to take the consequences." Owen stretched his long legs and looked up at the soft, brilliant blue above us. "Why do you call the world man's?" he asked. "It was man's. It ought to be. Woman's place is in the home." I suppose I sound like ancient history to you. And I laughed a little shamefacedly. "We have rather lost that point of view," Owen guardedly admitted. "You see—" And then he laughed. "It's no use, John. No matter how we put it to you, it's a jar. The world's thought has changed, and you have got to catch up." "Suppose I refuse? Suppose I really am unable?" "We won't suppose it for a moment," he said cheerfully. "Ideas are not nailed down. Just take out what you had and insert some new ones. Women are people, just as much as we are. That's a fact, my dear fellow. You'll have to accept it." "And are men allowed to be people too?" I asked gloomily. "Why, of course. Nothing has interfered with our position as human beings. It is only our sex supremacy that we have lost." "And do you like it?" I demanded. "Some men made a good deal of fuss at first, the old-fashioned kind, and all the worst varieties. But modern men aren't worried in the least over their position. See here, John, you don't grasp this. Women are vastly more agreeable than they used to be." I looked up at him in amazement. "Fact," he said. "Of course we loved our own mothers and daughters and sisters, more or less, no matter how they looked or what they did. And when we were in love there was no limit to the glory of the beloved object. But you and I know that women were pretty unsatisfactory in the old days." I refused to admit it, but he went on calmly. "The wife and mother was generally a tired, nervous, overworked creature. She soon lost her beauty and vigor, her charm and inspiration. We were forever chasing fine, handsome, highly desirable young girls, and forever reducing them to weary, worn-out women. In the name of love. The gay outsiders were already a fresh attraction, as long as we couldn't have them. See here, John, can't you understand? Our old way of using women wasn't good for them, nor for us either, by the way, but it simply spoiled the women. They were hopelessly out of the running with us in all human lines. Their business was housework, and ours was world work. There was very little real companionship. Now women are intelligent, experienced, well-trained citizens, fully our equals in any line of work they take up, and with us everywhere. It's made the world over." "Made it feminist through and through, I suppose," I groaned. "Not a bit. It used to be masculist through and through. Now it's just human. And see here, women are more attractive as women than they used to be." I stared at this, unbelieving. "That's true. You say they are healthy. There's a new standard of physical beauty, very Greek. You must have noticed already the big, vigorous, fresh-colored, free-stepping girls." I had, even in my brief hours of observation. "They are far more perfect physically, better developed mentally, with a higher moral sense. Yes, you needn't look like that. We used to call them our moral superiors, just because they had the one virtue we insisted on, and we never noticed the lack in other lines. Women today are truthful, brave, honest, generous, self-controlled. They are jollier, more reasonable, more companionable." "Well, I'm glad to hear that," I rather grudgingly admitted. "I was afraid they would have lost all charm." "Yes, we used to feel that way, I remember. Funny. We were convinced on the one hand that there was nothing to a woman but her eternal womanliness, and on the other we were desperately afraid her womanliness would disappear the moment she turned her mind to anything else. I assure you that men love women, in general and in particular, much more than they used to." I pondered. "But what sort of home life do you have?" "Think for a moment of what we used to have, even in a happy home. The man had the whole responsibility of keeping it up, his business life and interests all foreign to her. She had the whole labor of running it, the direct manual labor in the great majority of cases, the management in any case. They were strangers in an industrial sense. When he came home he had to drop all his line of thought, and she hers, except that she generally unloaded on him the burden of inadequacy in housekeeping. Sometimes he unloaded, too. They could sympathize and condole, but neither could help the other. The whole thing cost like sin, too. It was a living nightmare to lots of men. And women. The only things they had in common were their children and social interests. Well, nowadays, in the first place, everybody is easy about money. I'll go into that later. No woman marries except for love. And good judgment, too. All women are more desirable. More men want to marry them. And that improves the men. You see, a man naturally cares more for women than for anything else in life, and they know it. It's the handle they lift by. That's what has eliminated tobacco." "Do you mean to say that these women have arbitrarily prevented smoking?" I do not smoke myself, but I was angry nevertheless. "Not a bit of it, John. Not a bit of it. Anybody can smoke who wants to." "Then why don't they?" "Because women do not like it." "What has that to do with it? Can't a man do what he wants to, even if they don't like it?" "Yes, he can. But it costs too much. Men like tobacco, but they like love better, old man." "Is it one of your legal requirements for marriage?" "No, not legal. But women disapprove of tobacco-y lovers, husbands, fathers. They know that the excessive use of it is injurious, and won't marry a heavy smoker. But the main point is that they simply don't like the smell of the stuff, or the man who uses it. Most women, that is." "But what difference does it make? I dare say that most women did not like it before, but surely a man has a right—" "To make himself a disgusting object to his wife?" Owen interrupted. "Yes, he has a right to. We would have a right to bang on a tin pan, I suppose, or to burn rubber, but he wouldn't be popular." "It's tyranny," I protested. "Not at all," he said imperturbably. "We had no idea what a nuisance we used to be, that's all, or how much women put up with that they did not like at all. I asked a woman once, when I was a bachelor, why she objected to tobacco, and she frankly replied that a man who did not smoke was much pleasanter to kiss. She was a very fascinating little widow. I confess it made me think." "It's the same with liquor, I suppose. Let's get it all told." "Yes, only more so. Alcoholism was a race evil of the worst sort. I cannot imagine how we put up with it so long." "Is this spotless world of yours one solid temperance union?" "Practically. We use some light wines and a little spirits yet, but infrequently. In this country, at least. And Europe is vastly improved." "But that was a much more serious thing than the other. It wasn't a mere matter of not marrying. They used all kinds of means. But come on, we'll be late to dinner. And dinner, at least, is still a joy, Brother John." End of chapter 5. The Mountain by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Out of the mass of information offered by my new family and the pleasant friends we met, together with the books and publications profusely piling around me, I felt it necessary to make a species of digest for my own consideration. This I submitted to Nellie, Owen, and one or two others, adding suggestions and corrections, and thus established in my own mind a coherent view of what had happened. In the first place, as Owen repeatedly assured me, nothing was done, finished, brought to static perfection. "30 years isn't much, you see," he said cheerfully. "I dare say if you'd been here all along you wouldn't think it was such a great advance. We have removed some obvious and utterly unnecessary evils, and cleared the ground for new beginnings, but what we are going to do is the exciting thing. Now you think it is so wonderful that we have no poverty, We think it is still more wonderful that a world of even partially sane people could have borne poverty so long." We naturally discussed this point a good deal, and they brought up a little party of the new economists to enlighten me: Dr. Harkness, sociologist; Mr. Alfred Brown, Department of Production; Mrs. Allerton of the local Transportation Bureau; and a young fellow named Pike, who had written a little book on "Distinctive Changes of 3 Decades," which I found very useful. "It was such a simple matter, after all, you see," the sociologist explained to me, in an amiable classroom manner. "Suppose now you were considering the poverty of one family, an isolated family, sir. Now if this family was poor, it would be due to the limitations of the individual or of the environment. Limitations of the individual would cover inefficiency, false theory of industry, ill-judged division of labor, poor system of production, or misuse of product. Limitation of environment would, of course, apply to climate, soil, natural products, etc. No amount of health, intelligence, or virtue could make Iceland rich, if it was completely isolated, nor England, for that matter, owing to the inexorable limitations of that environment. Here in this country we have no complaint to make of our natural resources. The soil is capable of sustaining an enormous population. So we have merely to consider the limitations of individuals, transferring our problem from the isolated family to the general public. What do we find? All the limitations I enumerated. Inefficiency, nearly everyone below par in working power in the generation before last, as well as miserably educated. False theories of industry everywhere. Idiotic notions as to what work was respectable and what wasn't. More idiotic notions of payment. Worst of all, most idiotic ideas that work was a curse. Might as well call digestion a curse. Dear, dear, how benighted we were. Then there was ill-judged division of labor, almost universal, that evil. For instance, look at this one point. Half the workers of the world nearly were restricted to one class of labor, and that in the lowest industrial grade." "He means women in housework, John," Nellie interpolated. "We never used to think of that as part of our economic problem." "It was a very serious part," the professor continued, hastily forestalling the evident intention of Mr. Brown to strike in. "But there were many others. The obvious utility of natural specialization in labor seemed scarcely to occur to us. Our system of production was archaic in the extreme. Practically no system was followed." "You must give credit to the work of the Department of Agriculture, Dr. Harkness," urged Mr. Brown. "The introduction of new fruits, the improvement of stocks—" "Yes, yes," agreed Dr. Harkness. "The rudiments were there, of course, but no real grasp of organized productivity. And as to misuse of product, why, my dear Mr. Robertson, it is a wonder anybody had enough to live on in those days, in view of the criminal waste. The real turning point, Mr. Robertson, if we can put our finger on one, is where the majority of the people recognized the folly and evil of poverty, and saw it to be a thing of our own making. We saw that our worst poverty was poverty in the stock, that we raised a terrible percentage of poor people. Then we established a temporary commission on human efficiency, back in 1913 or 14. "13," put in Mr. Pike, who sat back listening to Dr. Harkness with an air of repressed superiority. "Thank you," said the eminent sociologist courteously. "These young fellows have it all at their fingers' ends, Mr. Robertson. Better methods in education nowadays, far better. As I was saying, we established a commission on human efficiency." "You will remember the dawning notions of scientific management we began to have in the first decade of the new century," Mrs. Allerton quietly suggested. "It occurred to us later to apply it to ourselves, and we did." "The commission found that the majority of human beings were not properly reared," Dr. Harkness resumed, "with a resultant low standard of efficiency, shockingly low. And that the loss was not merely to the individual but to the community. Then society stretched out a long arm and took charge of the work of humaniculture, began to lift the human standard. I won't burden you with details on that line at present. It touched but one cause of poverty after all. The false theory of industry was next to be changed. A few far-seeing persons were already writing and talking about work as an organic social function, but the sudden spread of it came through the new religion." "And the new voters, Dr. Harkness," my sister added. He smiled at her benevolently. A large, comfortable, full-bearded, rosy old gentleman was Dr. Harkness, and evidently in full enjoyment of his present talk. "Let us never forget the new voters, of course. They have ceased to be thought of as new, Mr. Robertson. So easily does the human mind accept established conditions. The new religion urged work, normal, well-adapted work, as the duty of life, as life itself, and the new voters accepted this idea as one woman. They were, as a class, used to doing their duty in patient industry, generally distasteful to them, and the opportunity of doing work they liked, with a sense of higher duty added, was universally welcomed." "I certainly remember a large class of women who practiced no industry at all, no duty either, unless what they called social duties," I rather sourly remarked. Mrs. Allerton took me up with sudden heat.
Yes, there were such, in large numbers, in our great cities particularly, but public opinion was rising against them, even as far back as 1910. The more progressive women turned the light on them first, and then men took it up and began to see that this domestic pet was not only expensive and useless, but injurious and absurd. I don't suppose we can realize," she continued meditatively, "how complete the change in public opinion is, and how supremely important. In visible material progress we have only followed simple lines, quite natural and obvious, and accomplished what was perfectly possible at any time, if we had only thought so."
"That's the point!" Mr. Pike was unable to preserve his air of restraint any longer, and burst forth volubly. "That was the greatest, the most sudden, the most vital of our changes, sir, the change in the world's thought. Ideas are the real thing, sir. Brick and mortar? Bah! We can put brick and mortar in any shape we choose, but we have to choose first. What held the old world back was not facts, not conditions, not any material limitations, or psychic limitations either. We had every constituent of human happiness, sir, except the sense to use them. The channel of progress was obstructed with a deposit of prehistoric ideas. We choked up our children's mind with this mental refuse, as we choked our rivers and harbors with material refuse, sir." Dr. Harkness still smiled. "Mr. Pike was in my class 10 years ago," he observed amiably. "I always said he was the brightest young man I had. We are all very proud of Mr. Pike." Mr. Pike seemed not overpleased with this communication, and the old gentleman went on. "He is entirely right. Our idiotic ideas and theories were the main causes of poverty after all. The new views on economics, true social economics, not the dismal science, with the blaze of the new religion to show what was right and wrong, and the sudden uprising of half the adult world, the new voters, to carry out the new ideas, these were what changed things. There you have it, Mr. Robertson, in a nutshell. Rather a large nutshell, a pericarp, as it were. But I think that covers it." "We students used always to admire Dr. Harkness's power of easy generalization," said Mr. Pike in a mild, subacid tone. "But if any ground of inquiry is left to you, Mr. Robertson, I could perhaps illuminate some special points." Dr. Harkness laughed in high good humor, and clapped his whilom pupil on the back. "You have the floor, Mr. Pike. I shall listen to you with edification." The young man looked a little ashamed of his small irony, and continued more genially. "Our first step, or one of our first steps, for we advanced like a strenuous centipede, was to check the birth of defectives and degenerates. Certain classes of criminals and perverts were rendered incapable of reproducing their kind. In the matter of those diseases most injurious to the young, very stringent measures were taken. It was made a felony to infect wife or child knowingly, and a misdemeanor if it were done unknowingly. Physicians were obliged to report all cases of infectious disease, and young girls were clearly taught the consequence of marriage with infected persons. The immediate result was, of course, a great decrease in marriage, but the increase in population was scarce checked at all because of the lowered death rate among children. It was checked a little, but for 20 years now it has been recovering itself. We increase a little too fast now, but we see every hope of a balanced population long before the resources of the world are exhausted." Mr. Brown seized upon a second moment's pause to suggest that the world's resources were vastly increased also, and still increasing. "Let Pike rest a moment and get his breath," he said, warming to the subject. "I want to tell Mr. Robertson that the productivity of the earth is gaining every year. Here's this old earth feeding us all, laying golden eggs, as it were, and we used to get those eggs by the Caesarean operation. We uniformly exhausted the soil, uniformly. Now a man would no more think of injuring the soil that feeds him, than he would of hurting his mother. We steadily improve the soil, we improve the seed, we improve methods of culture. We improve everything."
Mrs. Allerton struck in here. "Not forgetting the methods of transportation, Mr. Robertson. There was one kind of old world folly which made great waste of labor and time. That was our constant desire to eat things out of season. There is now a truer sense of what is really good eating. No one wants to eat asparagus that is not of the best, and asparagus cut 5 or 10 days cannot be really good. We do not carry things about unnecessarily, and the carrying we do is swift, easy, and economical. For slow freight we use waterways wherever possible. You will be pleased to see the all-water routes that thread the country now. And our roads! You haven't seen our roads yet. We lead the world."
"We used to be at the foot of the class as to roads, did we not?" I asked. And Mr. Pike swiftly answered, "We did indeed, sir, but that very need of good roads made easy to us the second step in abolishing poverty. Here was a great social need calling for labor, here were thousands of men calling for employment, and here were we keeping the supply from the demand by main strength, merely from those archaic ideas of ours. We had a mass of valuable data already collected, and now that the whole country teemed with new ideals of citizenship and statesmanship, it did not take very long to get the two together."
"We furnished employment for all the women, too," my sister added. "A social service union was formed the country over. It was part of the new religion. Every town has one, men and women. The same spirit that used to give us crusaders and missionaries now gave plenty of enthusiastic workers."
"I don't see yet how you got up any enthusiasm about work," said I.
"It was not work for one's self," Nellie explained. "That is what used to make it so sordid. We used really to believe that we were working each for himself. This new idea was overwhelming in its simplicity and truth. Work is social service is religion. That's about it."
"Not only so," Dr. Harkness added. "It made a threefold appeal, to the old, deep-seated religious sense, to the new, vivid intellectual acceptance, and to the very widespread, wholesome appreciation of a clear advantage. When a thing was offered to the world that agreed with every social instinct, that appealed to common sense, that was established by the highest scientific authority, and that had the overwhelming sanction of religion, why, the world took to it."
"But it is surely not natural to people to work, much less to like to work," I protested.
"That's where the change comes in," Mr. Pike eagerly explained. "We used to think that people hated work. Nothing of the sort. What people hated was too much work, which is death; work they were personally unfit for, and therefore disliked, which is torture; work under improper conditions, which is disease; work held contemptible, looked down upon by other people, which is a grievous social distress; and work so ill paid that no human beings could really live by it."
"Why, Mr. Robertson, if you can throw any light on the now inconceivable folly of that time so utterly behind us, we shall be genuinely indebted to you. It was quite understood in your day that the whole world's life, comfort, prosperity, and progress depended upon the work done, was it not?"
"Why, of course. That was an economic platitude," I answered.
"Then why were the workers punished for doing it?"
"Punished? What do you mean?"
"I mean just what I say. They were punished, just as we punish criminals, with confinement at hard labor. The great mass of the people were forced to labor for cruelly long hours at dull, distasteful occupations. Is not that punishment?"
"Not at all," I said hotly. "They were free at any time to leave an occupation they did not like."
"Leave it for what alternative?"
"To take up another," said I, perceiving that this, after all, was not much of an escape.
"Yes, to take up another under the same heavy conditions, if there was any opening. Or to starve. That was their freedom."
"Well, what would you have?" I asked. "A man must work for his living, surely."
"Remember your economic platitude, Mr. Robertson," Dr. Harkness suggested. "The whole world's life, comfort, prosperity, and progress depends upon the work done, you know. It was not their living they were working for, it was the world's."
"That is very pretty as a sentiment," I was beginning, but his twinkling eye reminded that an economic platitude is not precisely sentimental.
"That's where the change came," Mr. Pike eagerly repeated. "The idea that each man had to do it for himself, kept us blinded to the fact that it was all social service, that they worked for the world, and the world treated them shamefully, so shamefully that their product was deteriorated, markedly deteriorated."
"You will be continually surprised, Mr. Robertson, at the improvements of our output," remarked Mr. Brown. "We have standards in every form of manufacture, required standards, and to label an article incorrectly is a misdemeanor."
"That was just starting in the pure food agitation, you remember," my sister put in. "With apple juice containing 0.1% of benzoate of soda."
"And now," Mr. Brown continued, "all wool is all wool. If it isn't, you can have the dealer arrested. Silk is silk, nowadays, and cream is cream." "And caveat emptor is a dead letter."
"Yes, it is caveat vendor now.
You see, selling goods is public service."
You apply that term quite differently from what it stood for in my memory," said I. "It used to mean some sort of beneficent statesmanship at first," Nellie agreed. "Then it spread to various philanthropic efforts and wider grades of government activities. Now it means any kind of world work." She saw that this description did not carry much weight with me, and added, "Any kind of human work, John. That is, work a man gives his whole time to and does not himself consume, is world work, is social service."
"If a man raises by his own labor just enough to feed himself, that is working for himself," Mr. Brown explained. "But if he raises more corn than he consumes, he is serving humanity."
"But he does not give it away," I urged. "He is paid for it."
"Well, you paid the doctor who saved your child's life, but the doctor's work was social service none the less, and the teacher's, anybody's."
"But that kind of work benefits humanity." "Yes, and does it not benefit humanity to eat, to have shoes and clothes and houses? John! John, wake up!"
Nellie for the first time showed impatience with me. But my brother-in-law extended a protecting arm. "Now, Nellie, don't hurry him. This thing will burst upon him all at once. Of course it's glaringly plain, but there was a time when you and I did not see it either." I was a little sulky. "Well, as far as I gather," and I took out my notebook, "people all of a sudden changed all their ideas about everything, and your demi-millennium followed."
"I wish we could say that," said Mrs. Allerton. "We are not telling you of our present-day problems and difficulties, you see. No, Mr. Robertson, we have merely removed our most obvious and patently unnecessary difficulties, of which poverty was at least the largest. What we did, as we have rather confusedly suggested, I'm afraid, was to establish such measures as to ensure better births, and vastly better environment and education for every child. That raised the standard of the people, you see, and increased their efficiency. Then we provided employment for everyone, under good conditions, and improved the world in two ways at once."
"And who paid for this universal employment?" I asked.
"Who paid for it before?"
she returned promptly. "The employer, of course."
"Did he? Out of his own private pocket? At a loss to himself?"
"Why, of course not," I replied, a little nettled. "Out of the profits of the business."
"And the business was the work done by the employees?"
"Not at all. He did it himself. They only furnished the labor."
"Could he do it alone, without labor? Did he furnish employment as a piece of beneficence outside of his business? Ah, Mr. Robertson, surely it is clear that unless a man's labor furnished a profit to his employer, he would not be employed. It was on that profit that labor was paid. They paid themselves. They do now, but at a higher rate."
I was annoyed by this clever juggling with the hard facts of business. "That is very convincing, Mrs. Allerton," I said with some warmth, "but it unfortunately omits certain factors. A lot of laborers could make a given article, of course, but they could not sell it, and that is where the profit comes in. What good would it do the laborer to pile up goods if he could not sell them?"
"And what good would be the ability to sell goods if there were none, Mr. Robertson? Of course, I recognize the importance of transportation. That is my own line of work, but there must be something to transport. As long ago as St. Paul's Day it was known that the hand could not say to the foot, 'I have no need of thee.'"
"To cover that ground more easily, Mr. Robertson," Dr. Harkness explained, "just put down in your digest there that bureaus of employment were formed all over the country. Some at first were of individual initiative, but in a few years' time all were in government management. There was a swift and general improvement in the whole country. The roads became models to the world, the harbors were cleared, canals dug, cities rebuilt, bare hills reforested, the value of our national property doubled and trebled, all owing to the employment of hitherto neglected labor. Out of the general increase of wealth they got their share, of course. And where there is work for everyone at good wages, there is no poverty. That's clearly seen. End of chapter 6. Of Moving the Mountain by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The country was as astonishing to me as the city, its old beauty added to in every direction. They took me about in motor cars, motor boats, and airships, on foot and on horseback. The only horses now to be found were in the country. And while I speak of horses, I will add that the only dogs and cats I saw or heard were in the country too, and not very numerous at that. "We've changed our views as to pets and domestic animals," Nellie said. "We ourselves are the only domestic animals allowed now. Meat eating, as Hallie told you, is decreasing every day, but the care and handling of our food animals improves even more rapidly. Every city has its municipal pastures and dairies, and every village or residence group. By the way, I might as well show you one of the last, and get it clear in your mind." We were on an air trip in one of the smooth-going, noiseless machines commonly used, which opened a new world of delight to me. This one held two with the aviator. I had inquired about accidents, and was glad to find that 30 years' practice had eliminated the worst dangers and reared a race of flying men. "In our educational plan today, all the children are given full physical development and control," my sister explained. "That goes back to the woman again, the mothers. There was a sort of Hellenic revival, a recognition that it was possible for us to rear as beautiful human beings as walked in Athens. When women were really free of man's selective discrimination, they proved quite educable, and learned to be ashamed of their deformities. Then we began to appreciate the human body, and to have children reared in an atmosphere of lovely form and color, statues and pictures all about them, and the new stories. Oh, I haven't told you a thing about them, have I?" "No," I said, "and please don't. I started out to see the country, and your new-fangled residence groups, whatever they may be, and I refuse to have my mind filled up with educational information. Take me on a school expedition another time, please." "All right," she agreed. "But I can tell you more about the beast without distracting your mind, I hope. For one thing, we have no longer any menageries." "What?" I cried. "No menageries? How absurd! They were certainly educational, and a great pleasure to children, and other people." "Our views of education have changed, you see," she replied. "And our views of human relation to the animal world. Also our ideas of pleasure. People do not think it a pleasure now to watch animals in pain." "More absurdity! They were not in pain. They were treated better than when left wild," I hotly replied. "Imprisonment is never a pleasure," she answered. "It is a terrible punishment. A menagerie is just a prison, not for any offense of the inmates, but to gratify men in the indulgence of grossly savage impulses. Children, being in the savage period of their growth, feel anew the old satisfaction of seeing their huge enemies harmless, or their small victims helpless and unable to escape. But it did no human being any good." "How about the study of these victims of yours, the scientific value?" "For such study as is really necessary to us or to them, some laboratories keep a few. Otherwise the student goes to where the animals live, and studies their real habits." "And how much would he learn of wild tigers by following them about, unless it was an inside view?" "My dear brother, can you mention one single piece of valuable information for humanity to be found in the study of imprisoned tigers? As a matter of fact, I don't think there are any left by this time. I hope not."
"Do you mean to tell me that your new humanitarianism has exterminated whole species?"
"Why not? Would England be pleasant if the gray wolf still ran at large? We are now trying as rapidly as possible to make this world safe and habitable everywhere." And how about the hunting? Where's the big game?"
Another relic of barbarism. There is very little big game left and very little hunting.
I glared at her, speechless. Not that I was ever a hunter myself, or even wanted to be, but to have that splendid manly sport utterly prevented, it was outrageous. "I suppose this is more of the women's work," I said at length. She cheerfully admitted it.
Yes, we did it. You see, hunting as a means of livelihood is even lower than private housework, far too wasteful and expensive to be allowed in a civilized world. When women left off using skins and feathers, that was a great blow to the industry. As to the sport, why, we had never greatly admired it, you know. The manly sport of killing things for fun, and with our new power we soon made it undesirable."
I groaned in spirit. "Do you mean to tell me that you have introduced legislation against hunting, and found means to enforce it?"
We found means to enforce it without much legislation, John.
"As for instance?"
As for instance in rearing children who saw and heard the fullest condemnation of all such primitive cruelty. That is another place where the new story books come in. Why on earth we should have fed our children on silly savagery 1,000 years old just because they liked it is more than I can see. We were always interfering with their likes and dislikes in other ways. Why so considerate in this? We have a lot of splendid writers now, first-class ones, making a whole lot of new literature for children."
Oh, do leave out your story books. You were telling me how you redoubtable females coerced men into giving up hunting.
Mostly by disapproval, consistent and final.
This was the same sort of thing Owen had referred to in regard to tobacco. I didn't like it. It gave me a creepy feeling, as of one slowly surmounted by a rising tide. "And do you mean to tell me, Nellie, that you women are trying to make men over to suit yourselves?"
Yes, why not? Didn't you make women to suit yourselves for several thousand years? You bred and trained us to suit your taste. You liked us small, you liked us weak, you liked us timid, you liked us ignorant, you liked us pretty, what you called pretty, and you eliminated the kinds you did not like."
"How, if you please?"
"By the same process we use, by not marrying them. Then, you see, there aren't any more of that kind."
"You are wrong, Nellie, you're absurdly wrong. Women were naturally that way. That is, womanly women were, and men preferred that kind, of course."
"How do you know women were naturally like that? Without special education and artificial selection, and all manner of restrictions and penalties. Where were any women ever allowed to grow up naturally until now?"
I maintained a sulky silence, looking down at the lovely green fields and forests beneath. "Have you exterminated dogs?" I asked.
"Not yet. There are a good many real dogs left. But we don't make artificial ones any more."
"I suppose you keep all the cats, being women." She laughed.
"No, we keep very few. Cats kill birds, and we need the birds for our farms and gardens. They keep the insects down."
"Do they keep the mice down, too?"
"Owls and nighthawks do, as far as they can. But we attend to the mice ourselves. Concrete construction and the removal of the kitchen did that. We do not live in food warehouses now. There, look, we are coming to Westholm Park. That was one of the first."
In all the beauty spread below me the great park showed more beautiful, outlined by a thick belt of trees. We kept our vehicle gliding slowly above it while Nellie pointed things out.
"It's about 300 acres," she said. "You can see the woodland and empty part, all that is left wild. That big patch there is pasturage. They keep their own sheep and cows. There are gardens and meadows. Up in the corner is the children's playground, bathing pool, and special buildings. Here is the playground for grown-ups, and their lake. This big spreading thing is the guest house and general playhouse for the folks. Ballroom, billiards, bowling, and so on. Behind it is the plant for the whole thing. The water tower you'll see to more advantage when we land. And all around you'll see the homes. Each family has an acre or so."
We dropped softly to the landing platform and came down to the pleasure ground beneath. In a little motor we ran about the place for a while, that I might see the perfect roads, shaded with arching trees, the endless variety of arrangement, the miles of flowers, the fruit on every side. "You must have had a good landscape architect to plan this," I suggested. We did. One of the best. It's not so very unlike a great first-class summer hotel, with singularly beautiful surroundings. No, it's not, she agreed. We had our best summer resorts in mind when we began to plan these places. People used to pay heavily in summer to enjoy a place where everything was done to make life smooth and pleasant. It occurred to us at last that we might live that way. Who wants to live in a summer hotel all the time? Excuse me. Oh, they don't. The people here nearly all live in homes, the homiest kind, each on its own ground, as you see. Only some unattached ones, and people who really like it, live in the hotel, with transients, of course. Let's call here. I know this family." She introduced me to Mrs. Masson, a sweet, motherly little woman, rocking softly on her vine-shadowed piazza, a child in her arms. She was eager to tell me about things. Most people were, I found. "I'm a reactionary, Mr. Robertson. I prefer to work at home, and I prefer to keep my children with me all I can." "Isn't that allowed nowadays?" I inquired. "Oh, yes, if one qualifies. I did. I took the child culture course. But I do not want to be a regular teacher. My work is done right here, and I can have them as well as not, but they won't stay much." Even as she spoke, the little thing in her arms whispered eagerly to her mother, slipped to the floor, ran out of the gate, her little pink legs fairly twinkling, and joined an older child who was passing. "They like to be with the others, you see. This is my baby. I manage to hold on to her for part of the day, but she's always running off to the garden when she can." "The garden?" "Yes, it's a regular child garden where they are cultivated and grow. And they do so love to grow." She showed us her pretty little house and her lovely work, embroidery. "I'm so fortunate," she said, "loving home as I do, to have work that's just as well done here." I learned that there were some 30 families living in the grounds, not counting the hotel people. Quite a number found their work in the necessary activities of the place itself. "We have a long string of places, you see, from the general manager to the gardeners and dairymen. It is really quite a piece of work to care for some 250 people," Mrs. Masson explained with some pride. "Instead of a horde of servants and small tradesmen to make a living off these 30 families, we have a small corps of highly trained officers," added Nellie. "And do you cooperate in housekeeping?" I inquired, meaning no harm, though my sister was quite severe with me for this slip. "No, indeed," protested Mrs. Masson. "I do despise being mixed up with other families. I've been here nearly a year, and I hardly know anyone." And she rocked back and forth complacently. "But I thought that the meals are cooperative." "Oh, not at all, not at all. Just see my dining room. And you must be tired and hungry now, Mrs. Robertson. Don't say no. I'll have lunch in a moment. Excuse me, please." She retired to the telephone, but we could hear her ordering lunch. "Right away, please. Number 5. No, let me see. Number 7, please. And have you fresh mushrooms? Extra. 4 plates." Her husband came home in time for the meal, and she presided just like any other little matron over a pretty table and a daintily served lunch, but it came down from the hotel in a neat light case, to which the remnants and the dishes were returned. Oh, I wouldn't give up my own table for the world, and my own dishes, they take excellent care of them. Our breakfasts we get all together. See my kitchen." And she proudly exhibited a small, light closet, where an immaculate porcelain sink with hot and cold water, a glass-doored cold closet and shining electric stove, allowed the preparation of many small meals. Nellie smiled blandly as she saw this little lady claiming conservatism in what struck me as being quite sufficiently progressive, while Mr. Masson smiled in proud content. "I took you there on purpose," she told me later. "She is really quite reactionary for nowadays, and not over-popular. Come and see the guest house." This was a big, widespread concrete building, with terraces and balconies and wide roofs, where people strolled and sat. It rose proudly from its wide lawns and blooming greenery, a picture of peace and pleasure. "It's like a country club with more sleeping rooms," I suggested. "But isn't it awfully expensive the year round?" "It's about a third cheaper than it would cost these people to live if they kept house.
Funny, it took nearly 20 years to prove that organization in housekeeping paid like any other form of organized labor. Wages have risen, for all the work is better done and costs much less. You can see all that. But what you can't possibly realize is the difference it makes to women. All the change the men feel is in better food, no fret and worry at home, and smaller bills." "That's something," I modestly suggested. "Yes, that's a good deal, but to the women it's 1,000 times more. The women who liked that kind of work are doing it now as a profession, for reasonable hours and excellent salaries, and the women who did not like it are now free to do the work they are fitted for and enjoy. This is one of our great additions to the world's wealth, freeing so much productive energy. It has improved our health, too. One of the worst causes of diseases is malposition, you know. Almost everybody used to work at what they did not like, and we thought that was beneficial to character." I tried without prejudice to realize the new condition, but a house without a housewife, without children, without servants, seemed altogether empty. Nellie reassured me as to the children, however. "It's no worse than when they went to school, John. Not a bit. If you were here at about 9 a.m. you'd see the mothers taking a morning walk, or ride, if it's stormy, to the child garden, and leaving the babies there, asleep mostly. There are seldom more than 5 or 6 real little ones at one time in a group like this." "Do mothers leave their nursing babies there?" "Sometimes. It depends on the kind of work they do. Remember, they only have to work 2 hours, and many mothers get ahead on their work and take a year off at baby time. Still, 2 hours' work a day that one enjoys does not hurt even a nursing mother." I found it extremely difficult from the first to picture a world whose working day was but 2 hours long, or even the 4 hours they told me was generally given. "What do people do with the rest of their time? Working people, I mean?" I asked. "The old ones usually rest a good deal, loaf, visit one another, play games. In some cases they travel. Others, who have the working habit ingrained, keep on in the afternoon, in their gardens often. Almost all old people love gardening, and those who wish have one now, you see. The city ones do an astonishing amount of reading, studying, going to lectures and the theatres. They have a good time." "But I mean the low, rowdy, common people. Don't they merely loaf and get drunk?" Nellie smiled at me good-humoredly. "Some of them did, for a while. But it became increasingly difficult to get drunk. You see, their health was better, with sweeter homes, better food, and more pleasure. And except for the dipsomaniacs, they improved in their tastes presently. Then their children all made a great advance under the new educational methods. The women had an immense power as soon as they were independent, and between the children's influence and the women's and the new opportunities, the worst men had to grow better. There was always more recuperative power in people than they were given credit for." "But surely there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of hobos and paupers, wretched, degenerate creatures." Nellie grew sober. "Yes, there were. One of our inherited handicaps was that great mass of wreckage left over from the foolishness and ignorance of the years behind us. But we dealt very thoroughly with them. As I told you before, hopeless degenerates were promptly and mercifully removed. A large class of perverts were incapacitated for parentage and placed where they could do no harm, and could still have some usefulness and some pleasure. Many proved curable and were cured. And for the helpless residue, blind and crippled through no fault of their own, a remorseful society provides safety, comfort, and care, with all the devices for occupation and enjoyment that our best minds could arrange. These are our remaining asylums, decreasing every year. We don't make that kind of people any more." We talked as we strolled about, or sat on the stone benches under rosebush or grapevine. The beauty of the place grew on me irresistibly. Each separate family could do as they liked in their own yard, under some restriction from the management in regard to general comfort and beauty. I was always ready to cry out about interference with personal rights, but my sister reminded me that we were not allowed to commit a nuisance in the old days, only our range of objections had widened. A disagreeable noise is now prohibited, as much as a foul smell, and conspicuously ugly forms and colors also." "And who decides? Who's your dictator and censor?" "Our best judges. We elect, recall, and change them. But under their guidance we have developed some general sense of beauty. People would complain loudly now of what we did not use to trouble them at all."
Then I remembered that I had seen no row of wooden cows in the green meadows, no invitation to meet me at the fountain, no assailing finger to assure me that my credit was good, no gross cathartic reminders, nothing anywhere to mar the beauty of the landscape, but many a graceful gate, temple-like summer-houses crowning the grassy hills, arbors, pergolas, cool seats by stone-rimmed fountains, signs everywhere of the love of beauty and the power to make it. I don't see yet how you ever manage to pay for all this extra work everywhere. I suppose in a place like this it comes out of the profit made on food," I suggested. No, the gardening expenses of these home clubs come out of the rent. And what rent do they have to pay, approximately? I can tell you exactly about this place, because it was opened by a sort of stock company of women, and I was in it for a while. The land cost $100 an acre then, $30,000. To get it in shape cost $10,000. To build 30 of these houses, about $4,000 apiece. There was great saving in doing it all at one time. The guest house, furnished, was only $50,000. It is very simple, you see. And the general plant and child garden and everything else, some $40,000 more. I know we raised a capital of $250,000 and used it all. The residents pay $600 a year for house rent and $100 more for club privileges. That is $28,000. We take 4%, and it leaves plenty for taxes and upkeep. Those who have children keep up the child garden. The hotel makes enough to keep everything going easily, and the food and service departments pay handsomely. Why, if these people had kept on living in New York, it would have cost them altogether at least $3,000 a year. Here it costs them about $2,000, and just see what they get for it. I had an inborn distrust of my sister's figures, and consulted Owen later, also Hallie, who had much detailed knowledge on the subject, and furthermore I did some reading. There was no doubt about it. The method of living of which we used to be so proud, for which I still felt a deep longing, was abominably expensive. Much smaller amounts, wisely administered, produced better living, and for the life of me I could not discover the cackling herds of people I had been led to expect when such utopian schemes used to be discussed in my youth. From the broad, shady avenues of this quiet place we looked over green hedges or wire fences thick with honeysuckle and rose, into pleasant home-like gardens where families sat on broad piazzas, swung in hammocks, played tennis, ball, croquet, tether-ball and badminton, just as families used to. Groups of young girls or young men, or both, strolled under the trees and disported themselves altogether as I remembered them to have done, and happy children frolicked about in the houses and gardens, all the more happily, it would appear, because they had their own place for part of the day. We had seen the fathers come home in time for the noon meal. In the afternoon most of the parents seemed to think it the finest thing in the world to watch their children learning or playing together in that amazing garden of theirs, or to bring them home for more individual companionship. As a matter of fact, I had never seen in any group of homes that I could recall so much time given to children by so many parents, unless on a Sunday in the suburbs. I was very silent on the way back, revolving these things in my mind. Point by point it seemed so vividly successful, so plainly advantageous, so undeniably enjoyed by those who lived there. And yet the old objections surged up continually. The noisy crowd all herding together to eat. I remembered Mr. Maston's quiet dining room. They all had dining rooms, it appeared. The dreadful separation of children from their parents. I thought of all those children watching with intelligent interest their children's guarded play, or enjoying their companionship at home. The forced jumble with disagreeable neighbors. I recalled those sheltered quiet grounds, each house with its trees and lawn, its garden and its outdoor games. It was against all my habits, principles, convictions, theories and sentiments, but there it was, and they seemed to like it. Also, Owen assured me, it paid. End of chapter 7. Of Moving the Mountain by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After all, it takes time for a great change in world thought to strike in. That's what Owen insisted on calling it. He maintained that the amazing uprush of these 30 years was really due to the wholesale acceptance and application of the idea of evolution. I don't know which to call more important, the new idea or the new power to use it, he said. When we were young, practically all men of science accepted the evolutionary theory of life, and it was in general popular favor, though little understood. But the governing ideas of all our earlier time were so completely out of touch with life, so impossible of any useful application, that the connection between belief and behavior was rusted out of us. Between our detached religious ideas and our brutal ignorance of brain culture, we had made ourselves preternaturally inefficient. Then, you remember the talk there was about mental healing, power in repose, the human machine, or was that a bit later? Anyway, people had begun to waken up to the fact that they could do things with their brains. At first they used them only to cure diseases, to maintain an artificial peace of mind, and tricks like that. Then it suddenly burst upon us. 2 or 3 important books came along nearly at once, and hosts of articles, that we could use this wonderful mental power every day to live with. That all these scientific facts and laws had an application to life, human life. I nodded appreciatively. I was getting quite fond of my brother-in-law. We were in a small, comfortable motor-boat, gliding swiftly and noiselessly up the beautiful Hudson. Its blue cleanness was a joy. I could see fish, real fish, in the clear water when we were still. The banks were one long succession of gardens, palaces, cottages, and rich woodlands, charming to view. "It's the time that puzzles me more than the thing," I said. "Even more than the money. How on earth so much could be done in so little time?" "That's because you conceive of it as being done in one place after another, instead of in every city at once," Owen replied. "If one city in one year could end the smoke nuisance, so could all the cities on earth if they chose to. We chose to all over the country, practically at once." "But you speak of evolution. Evolution is the slowest of slow processes. It took us thousands of dragging years to evolve the civilization of 1910, and you show me a 1940 that seems thousands of years beyond that." "Yes, but what you call evolution was that of unaided nature. Social evolution is a distinct process. Below us, you see, all improvements had to be built into the stock, transmitted by heredity. The social organism is open to lateral transmission, what we used to call education. We never understood it. We thought it was to supply certain piles of information, mostly useless, or to develop certain qualities." "And what do you think it is now?" I asked. "We know now that the social process is to constantly improve and develop society. This has a necessary corollary of improvement in individuals. But the thing that matters most is growth in the social spirit and body." "You're beyond me now, Owen." "Yes, don't you notice that ever since you began to study our advance, what puzzles you most is not the visible details about you, but a changed spirit in people? 30 years ago, if you showed a man that someone had dumped a ton of soot in his front yard, he would have been furious and had the man arrested and punished. If you had showed him that numbers of men were dumping thousands of tons of soot all over his city every year, he would have neither felt nor acted. It's the other way now." "You speak as if man had really learned to love his neighbor as himself," I said sarcastically. "And why not? If you have a horse on whose strength you absolutely depend to make a necessary journey, you take good care of that horse and grow fond of him. It dawned on us at last that life was not an individual affair, that other people were essential to our happiness, to our very existence. We are not what they used to call altruistic in this. We do not think of neighbors, brothers, others any more. It is all ourself." "I don't follow you. Sorry." Owen grinned at me amiably. "No matter, old chap. You can see results, and we'll have to take the reasons on trust. Now here's this particular river with its natural beauties and its unnatural defilements. We simply stopped defiling it, and one season's rain did the rest." "Did the rains wash away the railroads?" "Oh, no, they're there still. But the use of electric power has removed the worst evils. There is no smoke, dust, cinders, and a yearly savings of millions in forest fires on the side. Also very little noise. Come and see the way it works now." We ran in at Yonkers. I wouldn't have known the old town. It was as beautiful as Posillipo. "Where are the factories?" I asked. "There, and there, and there." "Why, those are palaces!" "Well, why not? Why shouldn't people work in palaces? It doesn't cost any more to make a beautiful building than an ugly one. Remember, we are much richer now and have plenty of time, and the spirit of beauty is encouraged." I looked at the rows of quiet, stately buildings, wide-windowed, garden-roofed. "Electric power there, too?" I suggested. Owen nodded again. "Everywhere," he said. "We store electricity all the time with windmills, water mills, tide mills, solar engines, even hand power." "What?" "I mean it," he said. "There are all kinds of storage batteries now. Huge ones for mills, little ones for houses, and there are ever so many people whose work does not give them bodily exercise, and who do not care much for games. So we have both hand and foot attachments, and a vigorous man or woman, or child for that matter, can work away for half an hour and have the pleasant feeling that the power used will heat the house or run the motor. Is that why I don't smell gasoline in the streets? Yes. We use all those sloppy, smelly things in special places, and apply all the power by electric storage mostly. You saw the little batteries in our boat." Then he showed me the railroad. There were 6 tracks, clean and shiny, thick turf between them. "The inside 4 are for the special trains, rapid transit and long-distance freight. The outside 2 are open to anyone." We stopped long enough to see some trains go by, the express at an incredible speed, yet only buzzing softly, and the fast freight, cars seemingly of aluminum, like a string of silver beads. "We use aluminum for almost everything. You know, it is only a question of power. The stuff is endless," Owen explained. And all the time, on the outside tracks, which had a single track at every station, he told me, ran single coaches or short trains, both passenger and freight, at a comfortable speed. "All kinds of regular short-distance traffic runs this way. It's a great convenience, but the regular highroads are the best. Have you noticed?" I had seen from the air motor how broad and fine they looked, but told him I had made no special study of them. "Come on, while we're about it," he said, and called a little car. We ran up the hills to Old Broadway, and along its shaded reaches for quite a distance. It was broad indeed. The center track, smooth, firm, and dustless, was for swift traffic of any sort and well used. As the freight wagons were beautiful to look at and clean, they were not excluded, and the perfect road was strong enough for any load. There were rows of trees on either side, showing a good growth, though young yet. Then a narrower roadway for slower vehicles, on either side a second row of trees, the footpaths and the outside trees. "These are only about 25 years old. Don't you think they're doing well?" "They are a credit to the National Bureau of Highways and Arboriculture that I see you are going to tell me about." "You are getting wise," Owen answered with a smile. "Yes, that's what does it. And it furnishes employment, I can tell you. In the early morning these roads are alive with caretakers. Of course the bulk of the work is done by running machines, but there is a lot of pruning and trimming and fighting with insects. Among our richest victories in that line is the extermination of the gypsy moth, brown tail, elm beetle, and the rest." "How on earth did you do that?" "Found the natural devourer, as we did with the scale pest. Also by raising birds instead of killing them, and by swift and thorough work in the proper season. We gave our minds to it, you see, at last." The outward path was a delightful one, wide, smooth, soft to the foot, agreeable in color. "What do you make your sidewalk of?" I asked. Owen tapped it with his foot. "It's a kind of semi-flexible concrete. Wears well, too. And we color it to suit ourselves, you see. There's no real reason why a path should be ugly to look at." Every now and then there were seats, also of concrete, beautifully shaped and too heavy to be easily moved. A narrow crack ran along the lowest curve. "That keeps him dry," said Owen. Drinking fountains bubbled invitingly up from graceful standing basins, where birds drank and dipped in the overflow. "Why, these are fruit trees," I said, suddenly, looking along the outside row. "Yes, nearly all of them. And the next row are mostly nut trees. You see, the fruit trees are shorter and don't take the sun off. The middle ones are elms wherever elms grow well. I tell you, John, it is the experience of a lifetime to take a long motor trip over the roads of America. You can pick your climate or run with the season. Nellie and I started once from New Orleans in February, the violets out. We came north with them. I picked her a fresh bunch every day." He showed me the grapevines trained from tree to tree in Tuscan fashion. the lines of berry bushes, and the endless ribbon of perennial flowers that made the final border of the pathway. On its inner side were beds of violets, lilies of the valley, and thick ferns, and around each fountain were groups of lilies and water-loving plants. I shook my head. "I don't believe it," I said. "I simply don't believe it. How could any nation afford to keep up such roads?" Owen drew me to a seat. We had dismounted to examine a fountain and see the flowers. He produced pencil and paper. "I'm no expert," he said. "I can't give you exact figures. But I want you to remember that the trees pay. Pay. These roads, hundreds of thousands of miles of them, constitute quite a forest, and quite an orchard. Nuts, as Hallie told you, are in growing use as food. We have along these roads as beautiful clean shade trees, the finest improved kinds of chestnut, walnut, butternut, pecan, whatever grows best in the locality." And then he made a number of startling assertions and computations, and showed me the profit per mile of 2 rows of well-kept nut trees. "I suppose Hallie has told you about tree farming?" he added. "She said something about it, but I didn't rightly know what she meant." "Oh, it's a big thing. It has revolutionized agriculture. As you're sailing over the country now you don't see so many bald spots. A healthy, permanent world has to keep its fur on." I was impressed by that casual remark, "as you're sailing over the country." "Look here, Owen, I think I have the glimmer of an idea. Didn't the common use of airships help to develop this social consciousness you're always talking about, this general view of things?" He clapped me on the shoulder. "You're dead right, John. It did, and I don't believe any of us would have thought to mention it." He looked at me admiringly. "Behold the power of a naturally strong mind, in spite of circumstances. Yes, really, that's a fact. You see, few people are able to visualize what they have not seen. Most of us had no more idea of the surface of the earth than an ant has of a meadow. In each mind was only a thready fragment of an idea of the world, no real geographic view. And when we got flying all over it commonly, it became real and familiar to us, like a big garden. I guess that helped on the tree idea. You see, in our earlier kind of agriculture, the first thing we did was to cut down the forest, dig up and burn over, plow, harrow and brush fine, to plant our little grasses. All that dry, soft, naked soil was helplessly exposed to the rain, and the rain washed it steadily away. In one heavy storm, soil that had taken centuries of forest growth to make would be carried off to clog the rivers and harbors. This struck us all at once as wasteful. We began to realize that food could grow on trees as well as grasses, that the cubic space occupied by a chestnut tree could produce more bushels of nutriment than the linear space below it. Of course we have our wheat fields yet, but around every exposed flat acreage is a broad belt of turf and trees. Every river and brook is broadly bordered with turf and trees, or shrubs. We have stopped soil waste to a very great extent. Also we make soil, but that is a different matter." "Hurrying Mother Nature again, eh?" "Yes, the advance in scientific agriculture is steady. Don't you remember that German professor who raised all kinds of things in water? Just fed them a pinch of chemicals now and then. They said he had a row of trees before his door with their roots in barrels of water, the 3rd generation that had never touched ground. We kept on studying and began to learn how to put together the proper kind of soil for different kinds of plants. Rock crushers furnished the basis, then add the preferred constituents and sell, by the bag or the shipload. You can have a radish bed in a box on your window sill, if you like radishes, that will raise you the fattest, sweetest, juiciest, crispest, tenderest little pink beauties you ever saw, all the year round. No weed seeds in that soil either." We rolled slowly back in the green shade. There was plenty of traffic, but all quiet, orderly and comfortable. The people were a constant surprise to me. They were certainly better looking, even the poorest, and on the faces of the newest immigrants there was an expression of blazing hope that was almost better than the cheery peacefulness of the native born. Wherever I saw workmen, they worked swiftly, with eager interest. Nowhere did I see the sagging slouch, the slow drag of foot and dull swing of arm which I had always associated with day laborers. We saw men working in the fields, and women too. But I had learned not to lay my neck on the block too frequently. I knew that my protest would only bring out explanations of the advantage of field work over housework, and that women were as strong as men, or thereabouts. But I was surprised at their eagerness. "They look as busy as a lot of ants on an ant heap," I said. "It's their heap, you see," Owen answered. "And they are not tired. That makes a great difference." "They seem phenomenally well dressed, like a scene in an opera. Sort of agricultural uniform?" "Why not?" Owen was always asking me why not, and there wasn't any answer for it. "We used to have hunting suits and fishing suits and plumbing suits and so on. It isn't really a uniform, just the natural working out of the best appointed dress for the trade." Again I held my tongue, not asking how they could afford it, but remembering the shorter hours, the larger incomes, the more universal education. We got back to Yonkers, put up the car — these things could be hired, I found, for 25 cents an hour — and had lunch in a little eating place which bore out Hallie's statement as to the high standard of food everywhere. Our meal was 25 cents for each of us. I saw Owen smile at me, but I refused to be surprised. We settled down in our boat again, and pushed smoothly up the river. "I wish you'd get one thing clear in my mind," I said at last. "Just how did you tackle the liquor question? I haven't seen a saloon or a drunken man. Nellie said something about people's not wanting to drink any more, but there were several millions who did want to 30 years ago, and plenty of people who wanted them to. What were your steps?" "The first step was to eliminate the self-interest of the dealer, the big business pressure that had to make drunkards. That was done in state after state within a few years by introducing government ownership and management. With that went an absolute government guarantee of purity. In 5 or 6 years there was no bad liquor sold, and no public drinking places except government ones. But that wasn't enough, not by a long way. It wasn't the love of liquor that supported the public house, it was the need of the public house itself." I stared rather uncertainly. "The meeting place," he went on. "Men have to get together. We have had public houses as long as we have had private ones, almost. It is a social need." "A social need with a pretty bad result, it seems to me," I said. "Taking men away from their families, leading to all manner of vicious indulgence." "Yes, they used to, but that was because only men used them. I said a social need, not a masculine one. We have met it in this way. Whenever we build private houses — if it is the lowest country unit or the highest city block — we build accommodations for living together. Every little village has its town house, with club rooms of all sorts. The people flock together freely for games, for talk, for lectures and plays and dances and sermons. It is universal. And in the city you don't see a saloon on every corner, but you do see almost as many places where you can meet a man and talk with him on equal ground." "Meet a woman, too," I suggested. "Yes. Especially yes. People can meet as individuals or in groups, freely and frequently in city or country. But men cannot flock by themselves in special places provided for their special vices, without taking a great deal of extra trouble." "I should think they would take the trouble, then," said I. "But why? When there is every arrangement made for a natural good time, when you are not overworked, not underfed, not miserable and hopeless, when you can drop into a comfortable chair and have excellent food and drink in pleasant company, and hear good music, or speaking, or reading, or see pictures, or if you like, play any kind of game — swim, ride, fly, do what you want to, for change and recreation — why long for liquor in a low place?" "But the men, the real men, people as they were," I insisted. "You had a world full of drinking men who liked the saloon. Did you — what do you call it — eliminate them?" "A few of them — yes," he replied gravely. "Some preferred it. Others, thoroughgoing dipsomaniacs, we gave hospital treatment and permanent restraint. They lived and worked and were well provided for in places where there was no liquor. But there were not many of that kind. Most men drank under a constant pressure of conditions driving them to do it, and the mere force of habit. Just remember that the weight and terror of life is lifted off us, for good and all." "Socialism, you mean?" "Yes, real socialism. The wealth and power of all of us belongs to all of us now. The wolf is dead." "Other things besides poverty drove a man to drink in my time," I ventured. "Oh, yes, and some men continue to drink. I told you there was liquor to be had, good liquor, too. And other drug habits held on for a while." But we stopped the source of the trouble. The old men died off, the younger ones got over it, and the new ones, that's what you don't realize yet. We make a new kind of people now." He was silent, his strong mouth set in a kind smile, his eyes looking far up the blue river. "Well, what comes next? What's done it?" I demanded. "Religion, education, or those everlasting women?" He laughed outright. Laughed till the boat rocked. "How you do hate to admit that it's their turn! John, haven't we had full swing, everything in our hands for all historic time? They've only begun. 30 years? Why, John, they've done so much in these 30 years that the world's heart is glad at last. You don't know." I didn't know. But I did feel a distinct resentment at being treated like an extinct species. "They have simply stepped on to an eminence men have been all these years building," I said. "We have done all the hard work, are doing it yet for all I see. We have made it possible for them to live at all. We've made the whole civilization of the world. They just profit by it. And now you speak as if somehow they had managed to achieve more than we have." Owen considered a while thoughtfully. "What you say is true. We have done a good deal of the work. We did largely make and modify our civilization. But if you read some of the newer histories—" He stopped and looked at me as if I had just happened. "Why, you don't know yet, do you? History has been rewritten." "You speak as if history was a one-act play." "I don't mean it's all done, of course, but we do have now a complete new treatment of the world's history. Each nation its own, some several of them. There's no dead level of agreement, I can assure you. But our old androcentric version of life began to be questioned about 1910, I think, and new versions appeared, more and more of them. The big scholars took it up, there was new research work, and now we are not so glib in our assurance that we did it all." "You're getting pretty close to things I used to know something about," I remarked dryly. "If you knew all that was known, you wouldn't know this, John. Don't you remember what Lester Ward calls the illusion of the near? How the most familiar facts were precisely those we often failed to understand? In all our history, ancient and modern, we had the underlying assumption that men were the human race, the people who did things, and that women were—their women. And precisely what have you lately discovered? That Horatio at the bridge was Horatia, after all? That the world was conquered by an Alexandra and a Napoleona?" I laughed with some bitterness. "No," said Owen gently. "There is no question about the battles. Men did the fighting, of course. But we have learned that the decisive battles of history were not so decisive as we thought them. Man, as a destructive agent, did modify history, unquestionably. What did make history, make civilization, was constructive industry. And for many ages women did most of that. Did women build the pyramids, the Acropolis, the roads of Rome? No, nor many other things. But they gave the world its first start in agriculture and the care of animals. They clothed it and fed it and ornamented it and kept it warm. Their ceaseless industry made rich the simple early cultures. Consider, without men, Egypt and Assyria could not have fought. But they could have grown rich and wise. Without women they could have fought until the last man died alone, if the food held out. But I won't bother you with this, John. You'll get all you want out of books better than I can give it. What I set out to say was that the most important influence in weeding out intemperance was that of the women. I was in a very bad temper by this time. It was disagreeable enough to have this, or any other part of it, true. But what I could not stand was to see that big-hearted man speak of it in such a cheerful, matter-of-fact way. "Have the men of today no pride?" I asked. "How can you stand it? Being treated as inferiors by women?" "Women stood it for 10,000 years," he answered. "Being treated as inferiors by men." We went home in silence. End of chapter 8.